This week's episode of the ArtTactic Podcast is brought to you by ArtTactic.com, where you can now check out all of our latest coverage of the May, Hong Kong, and New York auctions. We break down how the auctions performed and what they mean for the market moving forward. And as a loyal listener of the podcast, you can save 15% on these reports and all reports on ArtTactic.com by using the promo code podcast15 at checkout. Thanks for listening to the Art Tactic Podcast. I'm your host, Adam Green. I think most people in the art world do care about the climate, in their personal lives, in their values, but that concern doesn't always carry over into how we operate in the art world. When you look at the endless shipping, the constant international travel, it's clear we haven't fully reflected on the environmental impact of how we work. Instead, it feels like we tend to keep doing things the same way we always have. So in this week's episode of the podcast, we chat with Annabel Keenan, the author of the new book, Climate Action in the Art World, Towards a Greener Future. Her book really is one of the first to take a comprehensive look at how the art world can take real steps towards addressing the climate. In our conversation, we talk about why climate action took so long to gain traction in the art world, what changes are actually possible, and how both institutions and individuals can start making an impact. We hope you enjoy the conversation. Thanks so much for listening. Annabel, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Well, congrats on your new book. It's really exciting, and I think it's a very important topic, but I have to be honest, it's one we haven't really discussed on the podcast because it's just not something that's covered regularly, honestly, throughout art media. So your book is one of the first comprehensive looks at climate action across the art world. Before we get into some of the details of the book, I'm curious, what initially motivated you to focus so deeply on this intersection of art and sustainability?
Yeah, so the topic has always been something I've been very interested in separately, art and environmental sustainability, and just the preservation of the natural world and climate, and just growing up in a rural town in Connecticut, just something I've always cared about. And it really wasn't until 2020 when COVID-19 kind of paused operations of the entire world, including the art industry, that the two really became, they kind of came to a head. And, as a freelance writer or any type of writer, we can really only write what publications are willing to publish. And they're only going to publish what they think readers want to read. And 2020 was really a time when people across the industry were asking questions of themselves, of their operations. And so that's when I realized that these two topics that I've cared about deeply, they really do go hand in hand. And I think it's become even more of a fact since then. And intertwined with that, there's also social justice, political justice. There's a lot of different layers to climate action that I think have really been an important issue, especially in the last 5 years. So for me, that's really where I came into it.
And so you mentioned in your book that climate action wasn't part of the mainstream art conversation until recently. Why do you think it took so long for the art world to catch up? I mean, I would assume most participants in the art world care about the climate, but it really hasn't been a vocal point until recently. And a follow-up question, do you think climate action actually is a real priority now, or is it still mostly just talk?
Yeah, so I think in terms of, what took so long, I do think it's important to note that, before 2020, pre-pandemic, there were a lot of really amazing groups working to make the industry sustainable. I'll mention Julie's Bicycle in London, which is a charity that helps cultural institutions, art, music, understand their carbon footprint and make changes to improve their operations. So there have been a lot of people working towards this, but in terms of mainstream art conversation, I think that there are a lot of reasons why it took so long. I mean, first and foremost, the art industry's impact is smaller compared to something like fashion, which has glaring issues that are easy to calculate. So it's kind of like if it's not broke, why are we fixing it? But at the end of the day, there are so many things that we can do to improve operations. I also think that across the industry, there is a resistance to change, and keeping the status quo can seem successful. So, in terms of the art industry, it doesn't really make sense for somebody to question something if it doesn't seem like it's a big problem. And if you're a successful business or a successful museum, I can understand why there's apprehension to talk about these issues. A lot of times when institutions are taking action, it can be because of personal moral interest that the museum or gallery workers are bringing into their jobs. I do believe that a lot of individuals and institutions are prioritizing sustainability. To your second part of the question about, is this all just kind of like talk? I do really think that there are people who are prioritizing this in theory and supporting it in concept. But saying you're committed to green practices is one thing, and taking action is another. I don't fault people for wanting to get involved and not knowing where to start, or not having the resources to start. Nonprofits in particular are underfunded, sometimes with years of deficit. And climate action takes funds. So there are several groups and people leading the charge with climate action. I'll name Gallery Climate Coalition, Artists Commit as examples of groups, MoCA LA, the Tate Museums as examples of institutions, and Hauser and Wirth as an example of a great commercial gallery that are taking action. But, I really do believe that there are a lot of institutions that are looking to others to see what actions they're doing to kind of figure out, how do we start? Can we do this on our own? So for now, I think that there's a lot of looking to others, and I do hope that leads to more action, across the whole industry.
Things like shipping and art fairs, they're really major contributors to the art world's carbon footprint. And it's something you dig into in your book. When I have my conversations with people, when I read things, it really feels like everyone acknowledges that it's a problem, but at the end of the day, it's the art market, and it relies on things like shipping. It relies on art fairs for trade, for people to make money, for artists to have a living. People discuss the impact on the climate, but then things kind of go back to business as usual. There's always another fair, always another show. Do you think there's real change that's possible here? Or are we just stuck in a loop?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really good question because it really points to two main issues with what I often call like the supporting industries, like shipping. One is that there needs to be an attitude shift. We, as an industry, the art world, is really accustomed to gratuitous flying of artwork and people around the world. That could be for private viewing. It could be because someone has a very high value consignment that they want to, show a collector in some remote town. That is a practice that's common. It often happens behind closed doors. Auction houses that ship entire sales across the world is probably a better example of one that's not behind closed doors. There are arguments to be made for continuing those practices. For example, if everybody who wants to see the show flies in to New York or wherever it is, then all of those people's carbon footprints for their flights kind of contributes to a problem. But I do think that in terms of the kind of existential crisis of the art industry is scrutinizing these practices and understanding, do we actually need to take the shipment? The second part of that question is the fact that we do have to ship art. We are a global industry. We have to ship people. Well, people fly as well, but In terms of shipping, there is great work that's being done. Shipping companies, we as the industry, we are their client. So if galleries and museums are asking for green options, they will do their best to provide those green options. And if they don't, then as clients, we can go to another shipper. That being said, I have been in conversation with some shipping companies. I recently spoke with the founder of Convelia, which is a shipping company, and he ran through some of the great green options that the company provides, which can be, for example, provide or shipping artwork by sea freight, providing museums and galleries longer deadlines to know how they can get on those sea freights, things like that. Um, and he said that a lot of people are not taking those options. So that's a problem because these companies are spending a lot of time to make options available. And if museums, galleries, collectors are still not choosing the green options, that's an issue that comes down to accountability. And it's hard to say what accountability looks like. I'm not really sure, how we can keep each other accountable, but business as usual is pretty easy to fall back into. Um, I think that one of the ways that we can push against that is by providing, in addition to a hard cost of a shipment, we can provide the carbon footprint of a shipment. So it kind of puts the onus on the person or the institution that's choosing the option. It costs X dollars, and here's the carbon footprint. Art fairs, as you also mentioned, huge part of the conversation that I love talking about because art fairs are inherently a very difficult part of the industry to do sustainably. They are short-term, temporary events, and the art fairs themselves are pretty much always renting the temporary spaces that they're in, whether that's a physical building or a tent on the beach. So everything is expedited. That makes it really difficult to plan sustainably. It's hard to ship slower options like rail or freight if it has to arrive on X date. It's hard to save packing materials. It's hard to know where artwork is going to be shipped afterwards. There are a lot of art fairs that are making really important strides. I'll mention the Art Dealers Association of America, which might actually be the Art Dealers Alliance of America, the ADAA, their annual art show. They have been working for years with a climate consultant named Laura Lupton to understand the impact of the fair itself and understand what it means to an exhibitor to exhibit at a fair. So they are developing with Laura what's called climate impact reports, and they're encouraging their exhibitors to fill out these reports, which essentially help the businesses, the commercial businesses, understand what their energy consumption and their climate impact is to participate in a fair. And then all of those reports together helps the ADAA understand its impact. And so through that work, they've created what's called a sustainability roadmap, which they publish online, and it can be used for other art fairs as an example to workshop their own issues. So they're a great example of a fair that's really doing the work that I think is really worth looking into.
I think you brought up a lot of great points there, and one that really stuck to my mind was the idea of shipping sea versus air. I'm shipping all the time for clients, and I have to admit that it's very rare. I can't even remember a time when a shipper has discussed multiple shipping options and their impact on the environment. Maybe every once in a while, they'll discuss the idea of shipping air versus sea, but those discussions really are about cost, not about the climate. But I do think if myself, other advisors, collectors were presented by shippers with different shipping options and their impact on the environment, that we would certainly factor that into our decision making when determining how we're going to ship artworks. But at the moment, it's not something that's really presented to us.
Hmm. And it also, thinking about things like that, insurance is also part of the conversation. Um, Sometimes if a work of art is of a certain value, it might be more difficult to ship by sea freight, for example, because of the inability to maintain certain climate control standards. So it's all of these supporting industries are part of the conversation, and collectors are also a part of the conversation to be able to have all the knowledge to make the decisions that help them, be a part of climate action, within the whole industry.
So, speaking of climate controls, one institution that you detail in your book is the Guggenheim Bilbao, which made headlines a few years ago for relaxing its strict climate control standards. Now, that seemed to me like a pretty bold move, considering how strict institutions normally are about things like this. For those who aren't familiar, can you explain what exactly they did and whether you think more institutions might follow their lead?
Yeah, this is a really big part of the conversation right now with museums. Essentially, climate control standards for museums, they are the temperature and humidity that museums must display and store their art. These standards have their origins in conservation guidelines that became commonplace after World War II. And they were created in London, and they were specifically considering climates of cool, damp cities in Europe. Over the years since then, these have evolved into the climate control standards that museums have to abide by today. Whether that's because they're part of something like American Alliance of Museum or ICOM, where they, become accredited, they have to follow certain guidelines. And part of those guidelines also allows them to be able to borrow artwork from other institutions. So they apply to loan agreements. But the temperatures and humidity levels very often exceed the actual requirements of the institution based on their own local climate and the object itself, which increases energy consumption, increases carbon footprint, increases the energy bill. And it's become a really difficult issue for a lot of institutions. I'll give as a straightforward example, a Jeff Koons stainless steel sculpture doesn't need to be kept in the same cool, dry condition as a photograph, for example. But the standards now essentially are blanket requirements across the board. And so the Guggenheim Bilbao example, essentially in 2022, they relaxed the climate control standards of a show that they had on view. It happened to be a show of all of the institution's own works, so they didn't have to deal with loan agreements and other institutions. And it was significant because, in essence, it's the institution going against the status quo instead of following the regulations. But the point is that it illustrates that the requirements were unnecessarily strict and being applied in environments they didn't need to be applied in. That decision saved the museum about €20,000 per month. And your second part of the question about are other institutions following suit? I know for a fact that other institutions are. There are a lot of great examples. Museum of Contemporary Art in LA and the Hammer. They both adopted new protocols from the Bezout group, which has green protocols. And they did this for their 2024 PST art exhibitions. The Tate Museums are also doing this in the UK. The Getty Conservation Institute is working to provide research on the issue to actually understand what the physical materials do when they're in different environments. And many museums are simply having conversations on how to do the same. And for a lot of them, it does come down to the fact that the hard costs of energy can be really prohibitive. I recently spoke with a museum director about this exact issue, who said that she and other small and mid-sized institutions really want to be able to take the steps to change their climate control standards. But they're essentially looking to the bigger names to make the changes because the smaller organizations fear being left out of loan opportunities or rocking the boat. So I do really think that change is possible. But again, I think that it's coming down to institutions looking to others to lead at this point in time.
I want to talk about some of the other individuals and organizations that are really leading the way. You spotlighted several in your book. Can you share one or two specific strategies or initiatives that has really stood out to you, things that are really making an impact in the art world?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the interesting things about environmental sustainability in the arts and climate action, it's interesting and also difficult, is that it's impossible to provide one pathway and provide guidelines. So a lot of it right now is creative thinking, and as a creative industry, we are so apt to do that. One of my favorite examples is the work that curator Alex Klein is doing at the Contemporary Austin. It's a great case study in climate action. Alex received a climate-specific grant from Tiger Foundation that gave the museum both the funds and a climate consultant in order to plan Carl Chang's show, Nature Never Loses, with sustainability in mind. And the consultant, whose name is Alexa Steiner, helped the museum plan sustainably at every level by just asking questions, rethinking systems, not coming in with like a top-down plan, but just truly understanding, can everything be done differently? What is succeeding? What can be improved? And that also is helping the museum track the carbon footprint of the exhibition. And this example is noteworthy because the climate conscious decisions are baked into the organization of the show itself, not necessarily just the institution. So as the show travels to 4 or 5 locations worldwide, it will include detailed instructions on how to stage the exhibition sustainably. And then each institution is also able to track its carbon footprint for the show. And so when it finishes the show in 2027, we'll have the first comprehensive analysis of the climate impact of a traveling exhibition. So for me, that's a very exciting example of climate action in an institution. But noteworthy things, it required a grant and a consultant because these things do take funds and expertise.
Yeah, that sounds like a really interesting initiative. So before we let you go, for our listeners who are in the art world and they care about this issue and they want to make a difference, but maybe they feel overwhelmed or frankly, they're not really sure where's a good place to start to make an impact on the climate. What advice would you give them?
Simply put, start anywhere. Start asking questions to identify areas of your own involvement with the industry and figure out how they can be improved. If you are an artist, there are amazing groups like Artists Commit that are working to help artists understand how to improve their studio practices. Pretty much every single climate initiative in the art world provides information free online. Gallery Climate Coalition has toolkits and guidebooks for anything you can think of, from art fairs to shipping to finances. All of this is available online. And there are small things that you can do. It doesn't have to be a total major infrastructural overhaul of a museum. It can be something as simple as, if you work at the front desk, you can say, can we use QR codes for exhibitions instead of printing dozens of copies of the same piece of paper that's thrown out? If you're a museum prep or an art handler, you can start saying, I know in 6 months when we deinstall, we're going to throw out this, this, and this. Can we find homes for these materials now instead of just throwing them out in 6 months? There are a lot of different ways. There are a lot of different resources. Not to plug my book, but I do highlight basically everything in the book. And this is like one of the only truly transparent elements of the industry. People love to talk about it and they love to share information. So really just asking the questions is the best way to start.
Yeah, I think that's really great advice. Annabel, thanks so much again for coming onto the podcast and chatting with us about your brand new book, Climate Action in the Art World Towards a Greener Future. We definitely recommend our listeners get the book on Amazon or wherever they buy books. We really appreciate the conversation. Thanks so much.
Thank you. I really appreciate it.